Since 1999, Nigeria has conducted 6 presidential elections. In 5 of them, 5 out of 6, the sitting or outgoing party used state resources, security forces, or structural weaknesses inside INEC to shape the outcome. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the documented pattern of democratic governance in the Federal Republic of Nigeria. And 2027 is not just another election on that list. It is the first election in which all 3 of those levers, state resources, security forces, and institutional vulnerability, are simultaneously under stress at the same time. Everyone right now is debating who will run in 2027, which names are circling, which alliances are forming, which governor is quietly flying to Abuja for meetings that never appear in any newspaper. But while that debate fills up the timelines and the television panels, almost nobody is asking the more important question: whether the institutions that will actually run the election can survive it. That is the question this video is built around. Before we go further, I want to plant something in your mind, and we will come back to it later, I promise. There is a particular clause in the 1999 Constitution that is almost never discussed in public. Not on channels, not on Arise, not in most political commentary. But it has been quietly studied by constitutional lawyers on all sides of the 2027 divide. Under specific conditions, conditions that are not entirely hypothetical, that clause could legally allow a sitting president to contest what would effectively be a 3rd term. I am not going to explain it yet. I want you to hold that thought, because when we get to it, the context will matter. But let me close the opening with the question that everything in this video is designed to answer. What happens when an election becomes the crisis, not the cure? Before we go any further, if you are new here, Naija Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are, whatever region you are from, whatever party you support, the political analysis that mainstream media will not touch. Not because they cannot find it, but because it is not comfortable, and comfort is what keeps channels on air. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets significantly deeper. To understand where 2027 is heading, you need to understand what converged by mid-2025 to make this election different from everything that came before it. 3 things happened, not one after the other, but on top of each other, simultaneously, like pressure building in a pipe that has not been replaced in 20 years. First, President Tinubu undertook a sweeping removal of APC governors' loyalties from federal appointments, a centralization of federal patronage that signaled clearly that the presidency was consolidating power rather than distributing it. In Nigerian politics, that distinction matters enormously, because the distribution of federal appointments is one of the primary mechanisms through which political loyalty is purchased and maintained. When a presidency starts pulling that patronage back toward the center, it does not just create enemies, it creates enemies with existing infrastructure. Governors, senators, party chairmen who have their own networks, their own resources, and now a reason to use them. Second, INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission, faced a significant funding shortfall for the biometric revalidation exercise that is essential preparation for 2027. The implications of that shortfall are not merely administrative. If biometric data is not properly updated, the voter register will carry forward the same vulnerabilities that were at the center of the 2023 disputes. Outdated data is not a technical inconvenience. In the Nigerian electoral context, it is a weapon. Third, a cross-party coalition of southern and northern senators publicly, on the record, began questioning the legitimacy of the electoral framework. Not one party, not one region, senators from across the divide, which tells you something important. When people who normally disagree about everything start agreeing that the system is broken, it is usually because the system is broken. The trigger for 2027 is not one actor, it is a structural collision, a presidency consolidating power on one side, an opposition fragmenting across ethnic fault lines on another, and a civil society that is exhausted, credibly exhausted, after watching what happened in 2023. And that's the thing about 2023 that we cannot move past without addressing directly. The 2023 election set a precedent that the courts, not the electorate, determine the outcome of presidential elections in Nigeria. That precedent, left unchallenged and unreformed, fundamentally changes what winning an election means in 2027. It means that victory on election day is only the first round. The real contest happens in the tribunals. And in a country where judicial independence is under pressure, where appointments to the bench carry political weight, and where the Supreme Court's 2023 ruling upheld the result on narrow procedural grounds, in that country, the legal battleground of 2027 is at least as important as the electoral one. This is not without historical precedent. Nigerians who lived through 1983 know what happens when the machinery of elections is captured by those in power. The result is an outcome so brazen, it triggers a military intervention. Nigerians who remember 1993 know what happens when an election is annulled after the votes have been counted and the people have spoken. The wound from June 12 took a decade to formally close and arguably never fully healed. The post-election violence of 2011, which killed over 800 people in 3 days, showed what happens when a section of the population believes the process has been used against them. And 2023, the BVAS controversy, the IREF portal that promised real-time transparency and delivered confusion, showed what happens when the gap between institutional promise and institutional performance becomes too wide to paper over. The pattern across all of these is not random. Each disputed election in Nigeria weakens the legitimacy of the next one. The cumulative effect is not just political instability, it is the slow erosion of the idea that elections are the mechanism through which Nigerians choose their leaders. And once that idea is gone, once it is broadly accepted that elections are managed rather than contested, you have entered a different kind of political system entirely. I will show you later in this video a geopolitical dimension to 2027 that I have not seen any Nigerian analyst map in full. It involves a country that most Nigerians are not watching. Keep that in mind as we go. Let us talk about the institutions, because this is where the technical and the political become inseparable, and it is also where most commentary stops short. INEC's independence is constitutionally guaranteed. Section 153 and the third schedule of the 1999 Constitution are clear on this. The Commission is an independent body. The problem is that its funding is routed through the executive, and that structural contradiction has never been legislatively resolved. Independence on paper, dependence in practice. In 2027, that contradiction becomes weaponizable in a way it has not been in previous cycles, because the funding shortfall for biometric revalidation is not hypothetical. It is already documented. The judiciary is the second institution under stress. Since 2015, every single presidential election in Nigeria has ended in a tribunal. Not some of them, all of them. The Supreme Court's 2023 ruling, which upheld Tinubu's victory on narrow procedural grounds, has now created a jurisprudential framework in which form can override substance. What does that mean practically? It means a candidate could win more votes, carry more states, and still lose the legal argument because the legal argument is increasingly about process compliance rather than popular will. The implications for 2027 are direct. Any candidate who does not have a legal strategy that is as sophisticated as their electoral strategy has already conceded half the contest. The National Assembly is the third institution, and in theory, it is the check on executive overreach. The legislature is constitutionally empowered to protect INEC's independence, to legislate the gaps in the Electoral Act, to hold the executive accountable on electoral matters. In practice, with APC holding a working majority in both chambers, the legislative firewall is currently the thinnest it has been since 1999. That does not mean it cannot act. It means the political incentives for it to act are weak, and weak incentives in Nigerian legislative politics almost always produce inaction. Here's what most commentators miss, and it is worth pausing on. The weakness is not INEC alone, it is the sequence. When INEC fails to deliver a clean process, the courts step in. When the courts fail to deliver a legitimate verdict, the streets do.
In 2023, we saw Step 2 play out in tribunal rooms across Abuja. In 2027, do not rule out Step 3. Now, the constitutional clause I mentioned at the beginning. Section 137 of the 1999 Constitution deals with presidential eligibility and term limits. It is generally understood to prohibit a third term, but Section 137 has subclauses that, under specific conditions, specifically a scenario involving impeachment and succession, where a vice president serves out a removed president's remaining term, create a legal gray area. The question that constitutional lawyers are quietly debating is whether, in such a scenario, the successor president's first term counts as a full term for the purposes of the two-term limit. There are peer-reviewed legal arguments on both sides. This is not settled. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is a live constitutional question, and the fact that it is being studied on all sides of the political divide tells you something about the nature of the calculation being made in 2027. The Electoral Act of 2022 also carries a gap that has never been publicly acknowledged to the degree it deserves. The Act introduced electronic transmission of results, a genuine reform, a genuine step forward. But it did not mandate electronic transmission as the sole legal method of result recording. That single omission, one clause, one word essentially, is the gap through which the disputes of 2023 entered the system. It remains unresolved going into 2027. Any analysis of 2027 that does not center that gap is an incomplete analysis. Let us move to the political strategy layer, because this is where it gets, in some ways, more revealing than the institutional picture. Who benefits from institutional ambiguity? The honest answer, structurally, is always the incumbent. An incumbent controls the security apparatus. An incumbent controls the federal civil service, the pace of INEC appointments, the deployment of federal resources in the pre-election period. In 2027, these advantages are compounded by the fact that Tinubu's administration has systematically replaced service chiefs, the Inspector General of Police, and DSS leadership with individuals whose loyalty to the presidency is the primary credential of their appointment. This is not unusual in Nigerian politics. It is the standard playbook. What is unusual is the comprehensiveness and the pace. The northern political recalculation is one of the most significant and underanalyzed dimensions of 2027. Post-2023, the northern establishment, which had broadly unified behind Atiku Abubakar, is now fractured into at least 4 distinct blocks. There are Atiku's PDP loyalists who remain organized, but whose candidates' repeated near victories without a win are beginning to produce fatigue. There is Kwankwaso's base, concentrated in Kano and with genuine grassroots depth. There are former APC governors who are repositioning quietly, carefully, watching which way the wind blows. And there is a younger northern technocratic coalition that is intellectually coherent, politically credible, and currently has no electoral vehicle. In 2027, the northern's presidential vote will be more fragmented than at any point since the return to democracy. And a fragmented northern vote in Nigerian electoral mathematics is an opportunity for the candidate who can consolidate even a plurality in other regions.
These southern dynamics are equally complex. The Yoruba political class handed Tinubu the margin of victory in 2023. The Southwest was the firewall. When the numbers came in, it was the southwestern states that gave the APC result its decisive edge. The question for 2027 is whether that class consolidates behind a second Tinubu term or begins to extract the quid pro quo, whether the calculation shifts from "we helped him win" to "now what does that mean for 2027 and beyond?" That negotiation is happening, not publicly, but it is happening. The Igbo political leadership is navigating something more complex still. The 2023 election produced something that goes beyond partisanship, a near-unanimous vote for Peter Obi that represented not just support for a candidate, but a statement by an entire community about its relationship to the Nigerian federal structure. That statement has not been answered. The question for 2027 is whether Igbo political leaders pursue a credible Igbo candidacy, which requires either Labour Party or a new coalition, or whether they risk strategic isolation again by backing a candidacy that does not reflect their community's evident political appetite. The most dangerous political actor in the 2027 election is not the leading candidate. It is the broker, the figure who controls which bloc endorses whom, who manages the intersection between ethnic arithmetic and electoral logistics. In 2023, the critical broker operated from Abuja,
In 2027, watch Lagos and watch Kano. The Governors Forum is the hidden variable that almost no analysis gives sufficient weight. Governors control state-level electoral machinery. They control security deployments, or at minimum, they have significant influence over how federal security forces are positioned in their states. They control local government chairmen, and local government chairmen determine grassroots voter mobilization in a way that no national campaign can replicate from the center. Any candidate who does not have at least 15 governors clearly aligned before primary season has already lost the structural advantage. This is not a minor observation. It is the core logistics of winning a Nigerian presidential election. And then there is the economic variable, which in 2027 may be more politically significant than it has been in any previous election. The removal of the fuel subsidy, the devaluation of the naira, and inflation running above 30% have combined to produce an electorate that for the first time in a generation may vote primarily on economic performance rather than on ethnic solidarity. If that shift holds, and it is not guaranteed, but if it holds, it disrupts every existing political calculation. It means the traditional bloc voting that has structured every election since 1999 becomes less reliable. It means a candidate with a credible economic message can potentially reach across ethnic lines in a way that was not possible before. And it means the incumbent carries a burden of economic accountability that is new to Nigerian presidential politics. I want to take a moment here at the midpoint of this analysis to pause and ask, what does all of this mean for Nigeria, not just for the election? Now, if what I have just laid out surprises you, drop a comment below. I genuinely want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes the frame entirely. A disputed 2027 outcome would not just produce a constitutional crisis at the center, it would accelerate pressures that are already visible and already building. The calls for restructuring, which have been a feature of Nigerian political discourse for 2 decades, would gain a new urgency and a new audience if the federal election is perceived as captured. Resource control agitation in the Niger Delta, which has quietened relative to the militancy years but never fully resolved, would find new political oxygen. And Middle Belt communities that are increasingly self-organizing outside of federal security structures because federal security has failed to protect them would have even less reason to maintain faith in the federal framework. The economic consequences are not abstract. Foreign direct investment in Nigeria is currently calibrated against political risk. Foreign direct investors, sovereign wealth funds, and development finance institutions all price Nigerian risk against a political backdrop. A second consecutive disputed presidential election would move Nigeria's classification in sovereign credit assessment from elevated risk to acute risk. That shift would directly affect the interest rate Nigeria pays on international bonds and would affect the naira exchange rate in the immediate post-election window. These are not things that happen to politicians. They are things that happen to households. The interfaith and interethnic dimensions of 2027 carry a weight that the political class has not publicly acknowledged in proportion to their importance. The 2023 election exposed the degree to which religious networks play an informal but genuinely powerful role in voter mobilization, networks that cut across party lines and operate independently of any formal campaign structure. It exposed the degree to which the Igbo community's near-unanimous vote for Obi represented something beyond preference for a candidate, a statement of communal political identity. In 2027, those signals will be louder. The question is not whether they will be present. They will be. The question is whether political leaders choose to channel them constructively or to exploit them for short-term advantage. Security is the dimension that gets the least honest treatment in Nigerian political analysis. Perhaps because it requires acknowledging something uncomfortable. At least 4 active insurgency or banditry theaters will intersect with the 2027 election cycle. The Northeast, the Northwest, the Middle Belt, parts of the South-South. These are not background conditions. Insecurity is the mechanism through which voter suppression, result falsification, and abnormally low turnout are operationalized in specific states and specific local governments. Any electoral analysis that does not map the security calendar alongside the political calendar is missing the operational reality. The most underreported story of 2027 is not who wins the election, it is how many Nigerians in the Northwest, the Middle Belt, and parts of the South will physically be unable to vote, not because they chose not to, but because of where they live and what is happening there. Now to the international dimension, and specifically to the country nobody is watching.
The US State Department and the UK Foreign Office have both issued calibrated statements on Nigerian democratic processes over the years. The language is always diplomatic. It is always carefully worded. But what matters is not the tone of the statement. What matters is the signal embedded in it. Both governments maintain observer programs in Nigeria, and if those programs are withdrawn, downgraded, or publicly conditioned on electoral reform, that is a credibility warning that international markets and institutional investors read and respond to immediately. Watch what the observer missions say in the 12 months before the election, not what they say the day after, what they say 12 months before. But the country, Nigeria, is genuinely not watching, and this is the geopolitical dimension I promised, is China. China's deepening infrastructure financing relationship with Nigeria is structured through agreements that have clause architecture tying repayment terms to regime continuity in specific sectors. Several major infrastructure agreements, ports, rail, telecommunications backbone, have provisions that are sensitive to policy reversals by successor administrations. A post-election administration that runs on a platform of reversing or renegotiating major Chinese infrastructure agreements, as some opposition platforms have at least implied, would not simply be making a domestic policy choice. It will be triggering a diplomatic and financial confrontation that no Nigerian government has yet prepared for. Beijing is not neutral in the outcome of the 2027 election. It is simply quiet. And in geopolitics, quiet is not the same as absent. The diaspora dimension brings this back to household level. The Nigerian diaspora in the UK and the United States is estimated at over 1.7 million people. Those communities remit approximately $20 billion annually, the largest single source of foreign exchange for Nigeria after oil. That number is not incidental to the political analysis. It is central to it. A disputed election that triggers sanctions, travel advisories, or capital flight would directly affect the exchange rate, and the exchange rate directly affects the value of every pound and dollar that is sent home to a Nigerian family. For Nigerians in the UK in particular, a weakened naira in the post-election period compounds cost of living pressures that are already being felt by anyone converting sterling to naira and watching that conversion rate move against them. This is not abstract politics. It is the monthly calculation of millions of households. Nigeria's 2027 election also sits within a wider global pattern that deserves acknowledgement. From Senegal to Kenya to Bangladesh, elections are increasingly being decided not at the ballot box, but in courts and on social media, through legal challenges that drag on for months, and through information environments where disinformation moves faster than fact-checking. Nigeria, as the largest democracy on the African continent, has an outsized signaling effect on how African democratic norms are evaluated globally. What happens here does not stay here. I want to address the counter-arguments directly, because they are real and they deserve honest engagement. The first counter-argument is one I hear regularly. Nigeria has survived disputed elections before. 2011 was worse and the country held together. That is true. But here is what that argument misses. In 2011, Nigeria had a stronger currency, significantly lower unemployment, and a security landscape that, while serious in the northeast, was more geographically contained. The cumulative weakening of institutions since 2015 means the system has less redundancy today than it had in 2011. Resilience is not infinite. A structure that has absorbed repeated stress without collapsing is not proof that the structure is strong. It is proof that the structure has not yet reached its threshold. The question is where that threshold is, and nobody knows the answer until it is crossed. The second counter-argument is that the opposition will unite before 2027 and produce a single candidate. I want to be fair to this argument because it is made by intelligent people who genuinely believe it. But there is no historical precedent for a unified Nigerian opposition coalition holding together from primary season through general election without fracturing. Not one. The structural incentives work against unity. Zoning calculations, ethnic arithmetic, personal ambition, the financial logic of having your own candidacy as a negotiating chip. The moment a single opposition candidate is nominated, every bloc that did not get the slot has to decide whether their second preference is the coalition or their own leverage.
the history of Nigerian opposition politics suggests they choose leverage. And then the misconception about the third-term clause, which I promised to resolve. Some will say this is a conspiracy theory. It is not. The relevant sections of the Constitution do not explicitly contemplate the scenario I described, a vice president serving out a removed president's term and then seeking election in their own right. Constitutional lawyers have published peer-reviewed arguments on both sides of that question. It is a live legal debate. The fact that it has not been publicly resolved by the National Assembly or tested before the Supreme Court does not mean it is not real. It means it is unresolved. And in Nigerian constitutional politics, unresolved is another word for available. Every argument in this video, from the North, from the South, from the institutional analysis, from the international picture, converges on a single point. The question is not which party wins 2027. The question is whether Nigerians from Maiduguri to Lagos, from Enugu to Sokoto, will accept the result as legitimate. A government that wins an election its citizens do not believe was fair does not govern. It manages a slow crisis. And Nigeria's national interest, economically, securely, diplomatically, requires an election that is believed, not merely conducted.
Let me give you the concrete signals to watch as we move toward 2027, because analysis without a watching brief is just rhetoric. On the presidency side, expect a push, likely framed as administrative reform, to amend specific sections of the Electoral Act before the election cycle begins in earnest. Watch which clauses are targeted. Any amendment that reduces INEC's electronic transmission mandate or that expands executive appointment power over commissioners is a structural play. It is not a technical fix. Read it accordingly. On the opposition side, the formation of a formal coalition before the third quarter of 2026 would be a genuinely significant development, a signal that the fragmentation of 2023 has been processed and acted upon. If no coalition exists by that point, the opposition will arrive at 2027 in the same structural position it occupied last time, and we already know what that produced. Once again, kindly remember to subscribe to my channel. I understand it means nothing to you, but it means everything to me. This work of research and analysis cost me a lot, and the only means of paying me back is your subscription. Thank you. The signals that would confirm escalation are three. First, a sustained and coordinated campaign to delegitimize INEC's current chairman before his term expires. Watch the language, watch who amplifies it. Second, security force deployments in opposition strongholds framed publicly as anti-banditry operations in the 6-month window before the election. The framing matters, but so does the geography. Third, a Supreme Court ruling on any pending electoral matter that further narrows the grounds on which results can be legally challenged. Each of these individually is a data point. All three together is a pattern. The long-term governance consequence if 2027 produces a third consecutive disputed outcome is not a sudden collapse. Nigeria is not a fragile state in the conventional sense. It has too much institutional mass, too much economic complexity, too many layers of informal governance to simply fall apart overnight. What it faces instead is something more insidious, the normalization of electoral illegitimacy as a feature of governance rather than a failure of it, a slow, self-reinforcing delegitimization of the federal state in which each cycle produces less faith, less participation, and less reason for the next generation of Nigerians to invest in democratic processes as the mechanism for political change. I asked you at the beginning, what happens when an election becomes the crisis? The honest answer is this: it depends entirely on what Nigerians decide to demand before the election, not after it. The institutional weaknesses I have described are real, but they are not irreversible. INEC's funding independence can be legislatively insulated from executive control. It requires political will, but the legislative pathway exists. The gaps in the Electoral Act can be closed. They were identified in 2022, they are still there, and a National Assembly that chose to act could act. And most critically, an electorate that refuses to accept a framework designed to produce a result before the first vote is cast is itself a force. The 2023 election, for all its controversy, produced a level of civic engagement, particularly among young Nigerians, that was unprecedented. That energy is not gone. The question is whether it is organized. I want to know your read on this. Which part of this analysis do you disagree with?
Where do you think I have overstated the risk, and where do you think I have understated it? Drop it in the comments, not the performative comments, the real ones, because this is the conversation Nigeria needs to have today, not in 2027, when it is too late to change what is already in motion. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening, not 10 people, one person, the right one. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Naija Update 24/7. We never stop watching.